In the database approach, notice here, now this is the cylinder, it's a symbol for the hard disk or permanent storage where data is stored. Notice that now all the data, previously they were in different departments under different hard disks. Now they're centralized together in one location. So customer data, employee data, product data, order data may all be stored in one location. When you store in one location and control access to it, you can also determine who can access the data, or you can increase sharing of data, all right? Now notice also that the metadata is no longer defined inside the programs. The metadata are now stored also inside a hard disk. The reason is that a database can contain many tables, right? In the case of a very large database, they can have hundreds of tables. And each table will have unique metadata to describe the data inside each of the column of every table. If you have 100 table, and each table has 10 columns, that will be 1,000 column description. So the metadata for a database can be very large. And if the database, if the metadata is very large, you basically need a database just to store the metadata. Okay. So what happened is that in large database system, the metadata themselves are also stored inside their own database system. Okay. All right. Next thing. Notice that there's something called a DBMS. So for short, it is a database management system software. So this is basically like Oracle DBMS, Microsoft SQL Server DBMS. So basically a DBMS is the software, which is basically the database system, all right? Now, the DBMS manages data resources like an operating system, manages hardware resource. Now, usually like your PC, your notebook, if you are using Windows, like you need an operating system like Windows. Without an operating system, you cannot see anything displayed on your screen. You cannot access the internet. You cannot send anything for printing to the printer, right? So everything is controlled by the Windows operating system. In the case of a Mac, that would be the iOS. In the case of Google or Android system, it will be their own Android system, Android OS. So in the case of a database system, there is a software called the DBMS that control all access to the data inside here. So for instance, if you are in personnel department should be allowed access to data about employees, right? Because personnel department's job is to prepare checks to pay their own employees. So they should be allowed access to see the data about employees. But you should not allow anyone in the personnel department to see data about customers, about products, or about orders, because these are not relevant to their business activity of that particular business unit, right? In the case of the accounting department, they need to generate invoice to send to customer. So obviously they need data about customer. They need to be allowed access to customer data. They also need to have access to the product table so that they know what price to charge the customer. And they also need access to order tables to know what did the customer order, right? In the case of the sales department, they will be allowed access to data about customer because they need to check whether the customer credit limit is good enough before they send them the goods without payment, right? They also should also allow sales department staff to access data about products and orders also, okay? So basically the DBMS control all access to the centralized data, which can be shared with any business unit, only if they're authorized to see them, okay? And here are the application programs. So basically any end user will execute those programs that will pass requests to the DBMS to retrieve the relevant data to be displayed on the screen of their PC or their notebook and so on, okay? All right, so advantages of the database approach will be the opposite of the disadvantages of the old file processing system. So first of all, the program and data are now independent, right? Notice here, the programs are here, the data are stored here, the metadata are also stored here, controlled by the DBMS. So the program and the data are no longer dependent on each other, which means this: if you change the telephone number of customer from 8-digit to 10-digit, it doesn't matter to the program, because in the SQL, when you want to retrieve data from a database, all you need to do is write an SQL command, select customer telephone. You don't have to specify the structure. You just have to specify the name of the column you want to retrieve from which table. And how the structure is will be taken care of by the DBMS itself. Okay. All right. So program data are now independent of each other. So if you change the file structure, it doesn't affect the program. You don't have to change the program or recompile the program. So this will help to increase productivity of application development by the programmers and also reduce program maintenance time. Planned data redundancy. Now, earlier we said that having redundant data or 2 copies of the same data like customer address is not good to have, right? Because it can cause errors. That is still true. But in the case of the relational database architecture, we need to have some redundancy. The reason is that redundancy is needed. When I say redundancy, means that you need to have some data from one table duplicated in another table. The reason you want to duplicate the data from one table into another table as another column is that so that you can link the 2 tables back together. Okay, without duplicating the columns, you will not be able to link the 2 tables back together. So that's why in relational database architecture, we cannot say that we want to have 100% no redundancy. Okay, you cannot have 100% redundancy. So what we need to do is to have minimal data redundancy or plan for some redundancy. The tables that we plan for some redundancy serves a purpose, which is to link 2 tables back together again. Now, so when you don't have multiple copies of the customer address, then you avoid wasting storage space, right? Because 1 column is enough to store the address of customer. You don't need 2 columns to do so. When you only have 1 copy of a data point, this will lead to increased data integrity and inconsistency. If you have 2 data points storing customer address, you can always create data integrity problem or inconsistency. When you have only 1 copy, there can never be any errors. Okay. Improve data sharing, because now all data is stored in one location. So the CIO can determine who will be allowed access to the data inside this the whole database system. Obviously, different user will get different views of the data. So if you are in personnel department, you should only be allowed to see data about personnel, but not allowed to see data about customers. Okay. And if you are in sales department, you should be allowed to see data about customer and products, but you should not be allowed to see data about other employees of the company. Okay. So improve data sharing while maintaining security of the data inside. Enforcement of standard, naming convention, data quality standard. All right. Now this one refers to here. Notice that we have 2 different systems created by 2 different companies. Okay. Now in the first one, the order filing system, inside the customer data, the customer flag files, they may decide that customer ID, we will give it a name and name it CUSTOMER_ID. Very long name, customer ID, the full name. But then in the accounting department, the programmer who was developing this invoicing system was very lazy. So instead, inside the customer file, this person may decide, let's just say CUST_ID, CUS for short for customer. Okay. So now what you may have is in different files across different systems, you have different names for the same thing. They are both customer ID, but they have different names. So this will make it difficult later on, even if you want to integrate data across multiple systems, it's very hard to do so. Okay. So that's why in the database approach, we need to standardize on the naming convention. And usually in the database approach, you only have one copy of the customer master file, right? So then you only need one name for the customer ID. Just decide you want a long name or a short name, but they can only be one name. Okay, so that is the naming convention. Now, the other thing is this. In the order department, the order filing system, now we have a concept called the primary key. The concept means, okay, let me give you an example. If we have a data about students, right? All of you are students and all of you have a student ID. Now, we actually have two students with the same name, you know. So in that case, how do we differentiate these two students? They will have different student ID, okay? So knowing the correct student ID, we can retrieve the data about the correct student, right? So that is called the primary key of the table. So in the case of a student table, the primary key will be student ID because it's a unique number, the uniquely assigned to each student. Even though you have two students, three students with the same name, it doesn't matter. All three students will have different student ID. Okay. So same thing here. In the case of a customer table or data, the primary key will in this case, let's assume they use customer ID. So they created a customer ID where the customer ID number is unique. Now, what may happen is that in the other system, created for the invoicing system, instead of using customer ID, they may use Hong Kong ID of the customer itself. In which case, these two different tables across different systems cannot be integrated back together also because they're using different primary key. Okay, so therefore all this can cause a lot of problems in how to merge data back together later on. All right. All right, so naming convention, standardize the name of every column name. Data quality standard, choose only one primary key rather than have two different primary key. Uniform procedure for accessing, updating, and protecting data. Well, in the database approach, there's only one language you need to learn, which is SQL, which will provide you a uniform procedure to access the data inside the database. Okay. Improve data quality. Now, this is a computer science term called constraints. In layman's term, you may think of them as business rules. So usually you interview the business unit, the end user in the business unit. You try to understand the procedures inside that business unit. So these are business rules that cannot be violated by database user, are called constraints. And those constraints can be enforced by the DBMS. So let me give you another example. Course registration system. So it could be that student can only register for ISO 5260 only if there's still free quota left. Let's say the class size is 40. So if we already have 40 students registered, we will not admit another student to be 41, 42, or 43. Okay, so that is a business rule. So if we set a business rule that we only, as long as we have free quota, we will admit students. But once the free quota is used up, we will not admit any more students. So that's called a business rule, and it can be enforced by the DBMS. So that means that you don't have to write your own program to do this check. The DBMS will check it for you on your behalf. Okay, so this helps to simplify programming in the sense that the DBMS will enforce certain rules on your behalf. Okay. Improve data accessibility and responsiveness. Basically, it's very easy to retrieve data from the database, even for end user who do not have any programming experience. In the case of SQL, there's a category of commands called the data manipulation language, DML, which will come back to later on in some other weeks later on. Okay. Now, in this DML category, there are only 4 SQL commands: insert, update, delete, select. So basically, all end user using these 4 basic commands can insert data inside the database, can update anything inside the database, can delete data inside the database, and also run select statement to create management report out of the database. Okay, so basically things are improved in a way of easier accessibility and responsiveness in retrieving the management report. That's what they think.